Hey everybody, hope all is well. Here's the recording for our class in Kant and Hegel from last week. So I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but the slides are also going to be published as well. So it should be good. We're going to be covering a few key concepts from each of these thinkers, ones that are going to be especially relevant for future thinkers and ideas. And I've put quite a bit of information on the slides, so that should be able to actually, like in case we need to go over it or whatever, we'll have the slides, and then the next couple of, or the first minutes of the next class will be doing like question and answer and discussion and stuff like that. So Immanuel Kant and Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, I think. Two very handsome men, as you can see. So beginning with Immanuel Kant, he's a German thinker. He's one of the founders of German idealism. He's an incredibly important thinker when we're dealing with contemporary like neoliberal politics and the just kind of the general development of I would call it almost like a normative morality in the West. A lot of it stems from Kant. So he was really synthesizing the early modern rationalism and empiricism, meaning that he was dealing with both induction and deduction. He places a huge amount of value on the capacity for a person to engage in reason and have the freedom to engage in reason. Just a quick thing, I've mentioned it before, but it definitely bears mentioning for this course. In most cases of German philosophy and a lot of Western philosophy, when you hear the word freedom, it's often related to the capacity to exercise reason in an unadulterated state. And Kant really, really gets into that. Hegel does as well, but it's a little bit different. But for Kant, the capacity to be autonomous, to be purely rational when engaging with your reality is very, I mean, that's like the height of human existence for him. We're going to be getting into that. So they describe Kant as a transcendental idealist, but he's a little bit of an interesting transcendental idealist. If you remember Plato and Aristotle's different views, with Plato, you would have the concept that there exists an ideal form of any quality or object, and that object qualities which exist separately from the manifestation of the material object itself. Whereas Aristotle said that yes, there are forms and yes, there's matter, but they're intertwined. To the degree that, let's say, there isn't a red apple in this world, for Plato, there's still the form of red and apple and their relationship, even if none exists. Whereas for Aristotle, he was more like, well, we can't really infer that. So that's where the empiricism comes in to deal with the induction, which then comes to conflict with the formic rationalism, ideal rationalism to a degree of Plato. And that's where Kant is really playing between those things. So he's certainly like a constructivist in a lot of ways. He, in terms of his epistemology, he really only considers the perceived world is not entirely representative of ultimate reality. He's very much into that like classic like critique of empiricism insofar as its capacity to actually bring us to true knowledge of things. Your sense perception is flawed and cannot fully describe or metabolize the truth, the essence of something. And so therefore it's not considered true knowledge through empiricism. So he's a constructivist into that point of view, but he does believe in an objective reality, which can be accessed via reason. So his core concepts are the categorical imperative, which is sort of the law of perfect duty. And that is something that is extremely important in the development of Western political thinking and in moral thinking. The concept of heteronomy versus autonomy, which we'll get into. And that's basically, heteronomy means basically other law giving versus autonomy. It comes from the Greek, heteronomos, versus autonomos, which is self-law giving. So you can probably infer from that, heteronomy is if he wants like absolute individual capacity to exercise reason, then heteronomy, whether it's self-imposed or imposed by others or imposed on others, is not so nice. Whereas autonomy is the human ideal for Kant. And then getting back to this epistemology, we have the phenomenon versus the noumenon. So the phenomenon is the thing as it appears versus the noumenon, which is the thing in itself. So that's that difference between the subjective empirical access that people might have through sense perception to the world, your engagement with phenomenon, things as they appear, because like we said, Kant doesn't necessarily accept that your sense perception can fully understand what's going on. So there's the phenomenal world, which Kant has what to say about, and then the noumenal world, which is the actual nature of things. Now, Kant's prescriptions and his framework of morality and his framework of ethics and of metaphysics and epistemology, they're all dealing with the noumenon. So we're dealing with a very ideal system, which is where we kind of get into that concept of transcendental idealism. That he's dealing with something and he's prescribing to the essence of humanity, not humanity as it appears, but what he considers to be the essence, which transcends sense perception. And we're dealing, by ideal, we essentially mean dealing with that essence. So just bear in mind that when Kant is giving a prescription, he's talking about the noumenon. He's talking about the absolute ideal and not necessarily the thing as it appears, the phenomenon. Okay, so super important just to go over again, autonomy versus heteronomy. So autonomy comes from autonomos, self-law giving. Nomos is actually a pretty interesting word to just have on tap, especially if you want to deal with, or if you want to look into fields, including like the sociological study of religion, any form of Greek, older Greek thought regarding the nomos. Nomos is where the concept of nominative, normative comes from. I mean, what you're dealing with this kind of, it's like a soft law. It's like a law of conduct versus the Greek cosmos, which is dealing with like a cosmic law. So in a lot of relationships, this is kind of a tangent, but in a lot of other documents or in a lot of other thinkers, you'll be dealing with this sort of relationship between a person's nomos or a community's nomos and a cosmos, which is where the word cosmos comes from. Right. So to be autonomous, it really just means that you have the unadulterated capacity to know what morality dictates and to act accordingly. So it's a two-part process. Basically, Kant is trying to instill or reveal through his imperatives this sort of this intrinsic autonomy, which exists in humans by virtue of them being humans, but being rational beings, to know morality as it exists within themselves, which then there's a nomos cosmos things that kind of goes in there as well, and then be able to be the agent actor, the autonomous actor that is capable of performing that duty, versus heteronomy, which is the antithesis of it. Heteros nomos, other law giving, and it's a state in which you're beholden to external influences. And that can be your own internal desires, it can be your own internal passions, anything which is not Kant rational, or it can also be being beholden to the nomos of other people. So it's a very interesting sort of relationship there. I mean, you could imagine Kant's ideal society basically as being like a society of perfect individuals, and it's like we said, we're dealing with a Newman here, not the phenomenon. So bear with me on that. And according to Kant, the autonomous will is the only source of moral action. Anything autonomous, anything which is not self-law giving, a law given unto oneself, an action which follows those dictates, which by the way means that you're subservient to reason, and reason according to what Kant assumes reason is, that anything aside from that is immoral. Right, so the categorical imperative is Kant's formulation of, or it has three formulations, and it's basically his law of perfect duty. When you have an autonomous will, according to Kant, you will come to the conclusion that the categorical imperative is the only rational way to behave, it's the only logical way to behave. It is reason incarnate in action, and you will abide by it naturally. And so therefore your self-law giving will end up giving the same law that any other rational being would come to the same conclusion of. right? So it's for him, it's the perfect moral duty. And like I said, this is legislation for the human numen. We're dealing with transcendental idealism. We're not necessarily dealing with like political prescriptions, which is kind of ironic because that's how it ends up in a lot of cases. So diving right in, the first formulation is universality. And this is essentially, in my opinion, hugely problematic. His entire metaphysic is very problematic to me when it comes to prescribing action. But all of the other formulations are going to be derived from universality, including like humanity and like other things. So you've probably heard this before, is act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So basically, do only act in such a way that you would want all things to behave that way at all times. That would become a universal law, a universal truth. You know, like if to you, well, it's complicated, but just that sort of Kantian formulation. Only do things that you could only imagine everybody else doing all the time, and society would be able to survive. Now, that's cool. That's a positive sort of thing. Fine. It's kind of like the golden rule in a sort of sense. But where it really gets tricky is actually like in the philosophical meaning of what he's getting at is, so this is the positive statement, but there's also the negation of it, which is that do not act in such a way that it would violate any universal law. Now, for instance, lying. The reason why you shouldn't lie is because if everybody were to lie all the time, and then lying were to become a universal law, then that universal law would necessarily negate the value of truth, right? Or if everybody were to behave according to their passions without consideration to reason, and passion were to become the universal law, then that would negate the value of reason. Or if you were to collectivize property within yourself, within your own community, and then everybody else were to collectivize property, then private property or productive property, private productive property would no longer exist. Kind of see where I'm going with there? It's a very reactionary sort of behavior. It basically, or a way of thinking, is it basically says that whatever the nomos, which is ironic because of Kant's use of that term, but whatever the societal norm and the societal nomos and the values are at a given point. Now for Kant, of course, he would reject it if it wasn't purely rational, but like, once again, he's going for the Newman, but at the same time, like, yalla, it's based off of certain presuppositions coming from, you know, Germany in the 1700s, is that if a person behaves in such a way that negates a value held by the status quo, it's called an immoral action. So it's basically reactionary, get in line to a point. And I've always had an issue with this because you can't really retroactively use Kant in a sense, which is the opposite of Hegel in a lot of ways. Because, like, for instance, like with the enclosure of the commons in England, the enclosure of the commons itself, which sets up the private property regime in the agrarian sector of England, that would have technically been a violation of the categorical imperatives universality formulation, because by enclosing, you have negated common property. And so therefore you have committed an immoral act. However, over time, private property becomes a norm, and then it gets to a point where if you were to, you know, start collectivizing, then that would be a negation of private property, and that's immoral. So, like I said, issues with Kant, but it's important to to understand the formulation itself, because it does rule a lot of conservative thinking. Don't change things too much, basically, is what Kant is saying. So the second formulation is a derivative of the first, and it's in relation to humanity. It's no longer dealing necessarily with with the universal law, but dealing with human interaction, which is, I actually kind of like this one. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So don't use people as tools. right? And don't use yourself as a tool. And so it's an interesting rationality that brings him to this, because it, remember, it's derived from the universality clause, which means essentially that for some reason to Kant, using a person as a tool is a negation of some form of universal law, and it conflicts with some universal law. Okay, so like, what is that? Basically, the concept is that the noumen is free will, which is the autonomy, the self-law giving person, the purely rational person, and all rational action, according to Kant, is fundamentally objective. Now, if you are to impose or to use somebody in such a way where you are not allowing them to legislate their own law, but are using them however sophisticated the mechanism is, if there's any, this is why intention, like for instance, a lot of people derive that intention is very important to Kant because of the second formulation. That's actually the part I like about it, or one of the parts I like about it. Basically, if you are treating a person as a means to an end, you're actually treating them as a subject, or as a subjective thing and not an objective rational actor. And then because you're treating them as that, you have become heteronomous and you're negating the principle of freedom, which is objective rationality. So therefore, it's immoral because it's heteronomous. Right. And so in a lot of ways, your actions which you're going are about proliferating and preserving your autonomy and the autonomy of others. And therefore, you're treating them always as an end unto themselves. Because remember, this is the noumen, this is legislating for the ideals, and this is where the intention becomes very important. So subjective action negates the objectivity of the subjects, to use that term, of the other person, and therefore it's immoral because it's negating objectivity, according to Kant. Then the third formulation, getting back to it, is the autonomy, right? So we're going universal, societal, individual. So the third practical principle follows, practical, as the ultimate condition of their harmony with practical reason. The idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will, right? It's kind of like Kant is saying that there's this objective rationality, this objective reason, which abides by universal laws. Every person needs to be able to participate in that. So therefore, you can't impose your will or treat another person as a mean to an end, because there's a dictate, there's kind of a microcosm of that universal law within the society. And then there's a microcosm of that society and the universal law within that person, and then that person has the capacity to universally legislate. So it's imagine like an inverted pyramid, and then it like with a column that runs through it, and you're basically running up and down through that. To the degree that because a person is supposed to act in such a way that they are actively reaffirming universal law, they're considered universally legislating. And it's a bit complicated to a degree, because it's basically like, imagine how a community like that would function, how a world like that would function. Because they're essentially saying, like, do unto others rationally as one does rationally. Do not act heteronomously. At the same time, we get back to my original critique, which is that the law, the universal law, which is running the entire show here, is quote unquote founded in reason, but it's also founded in the non-negation of established principles. And that becomes a huge problem, especially when Kant is applied later. Right. So if you remember David Hume, the empiricist, who was basically the big passion drives everything. He's the British one, whereas Kant is, the all rational guy. Be autonomous, don't be heteronomous. With Hume, you basically have the mind operating through passion, and then you have passion being the first principle, and then Kant having reason as the first principle. So you have the difference between what Hume would call, like, if we're going to talk about like the epistemology of action, like how do we determine how action happens, or what is a moral action? Hume would say that the mind works based off of the hypothetical imperative, which is that your passion dictates that you want X, and then your reason gives you the tools to then go do to achieve X, to So it basically goes like, all right, if you want X, then go do Y. So passion precipitates it, and then reason executes it. Whereas with Kant, desire is not on the table. So there's only go do Y. It is only do this in this circumstance, only this. It's in a lot of ways like Kant is almost like a dharmic thinker in a classical Indian sense, in terms of a strict dharmic thinker. In terms of that, there's this cosmic law for Kant, which is like eternally dictating every single one of your actions at a specific moment. And it's only accessible through reason and logic, but he doesn't leave any views for actually like changing that law, because it's a non-negation, or understanding it even a bit deeper. There's a bedrock of logic, or a bedrock of reason for Kant that he thinks is formulated. So as I said, sorry, for Hume, reason is subservient to desire. It informs you how to achieve one's desire. And then for Kant, you have the a priori obligations of rational beings due to their being such. So as a virtue of you being a rational human, you a priori have an obligation to behave like this because you are a human, right? So that's his metaphysics, that's his view of the soul, his ontology to a degree. And then I forgot that I still had this in the slide. That was a joke to myself. Read the Bhagavad Gita. I would recommend that anyway, but whatever. It's a good one. I really do recommend it. So Kant for politics. Super liberal. Liberals are major fanboys of Kant. And what can I say? Why wouldn't they be? He's Hobbesian to a degree, insofar as he would like to see any state which exists, while at the same time, like, in order to affirm the autonomous nature, in order to cultivate a society in which that autonomy is expressed at its fullest, the state therefore necessarily has to repress passions and desires. So you can see how that could be a problem in a lot of ways. And that is basically him coming to the same conclusion as Hobbes, from a slightly different angle, which is that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. People are killing each other all the time. People aren't inherently competitive, not cooperative. By the way, not a Hobbesian, pretty disastrous IMO. And therefore the state comes in, the Leviathan comes in to essentially crush those, repress those passions and desires, so you can actually operate like a functioning society. So Kant essentially arrives at that same conclusion, but like through slightly different means, like from deriving from his categorical imperative. So for him, the highest form of political life is republicanism and international organization, because once you have a state and a society which cultivates autonomy, then you need to create a forum in which all those autonomies can engage and internationally legislate based off of this law of pure reason. Right, as we can see, problems there. And for instance, the League of Nations, I actually learned this when I was doing just a little bit of research for these slides. The League of Nations itself was directly a Kantian institution. Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the people to really be posited it and thrusted it forward, he was a devout Kantian at Princeton, which once again, it makes a lot of sense. So infer from that what you will. Relating to Eldad, when it comes to Kant, I tried to find more information on Eldad, saying that Kant should be put on trial for the Holocaust. I didn't find any. I had issues finding a primary source for that, but I totally agree. What I know from the first ties, it's I think it's in chapter 2 or 3. It's the same bit when he's on the boat to Akko with his wife, and he's looking at the English sea captain, and he kind of goes into a dialogue or a discourse where he's comparing the methods of empire of the British and the German, right? So for the British, he associates them with Hume, the sort of liquid, like casual, almost unknowing, not looking into the future or into the past, which is kind of like oozing out way of empire. Versus the Kantian, which is deriving the necessity of empire from certain presuppositions, which is that pure reason, according to Kant. And then you have this systemic and beyond just blind, like inhuman, in my opinion, just zeal for the eradication of what they consider things which hold back the capacity for autonomy. And you see that a lot in Nazism, in Hitler's and Goebbels and their formulation of Nazism. It's pretty Kantian in a lot of ways. So as I said before, a lot of problems with Kant. Very popular thinker. We teach, our kids learn Kantian ethics all the time, like in kindergarten and places. If they do something and you're just like, well, how would you feel if everyone did that? That's Kantian logic right there. That's Kantian formulation. Obviously, we use it slightly differently, but there's an insidious sort of it's delicate, but there is what I consider to be a deeply insidious aspect of that universality clause. So yeah, so there's Kant. Right. Okay. So maybe we could discuss this maybe in the chat. Maybe I'll post a question. According to Kant, is annexation of Yehuda v'Shamron by the state as it is a moral duty or not? So I'll say it again. Is annexation of Yehuda v'Shamron by the state as such and the state as is a moral duty? Okay. Hegel, GWF. Later than Kant, but a little bit of overlap. You have your German idealism. Hegel's super cool, very dense, very tough to read, I think, for a lot of people. It's almost a meme online right now of like people like flexing the fact that they've read like 2 pages of phenomenology of spirit, and for them, I kudos, genuinely. So with Hegel, you basically have the idea of a phenomenon as being finite, and everything is subsumed into what's called the world spirit, the Geist, which is really the main actor in history. And Hegel has, for those of us like us who are familiar with Kabbalah and like with our mysticism and our knowledge of experiential reality, this is and of greater reality, this is actually a very there's a lot of resonances in Hegel's formulations to a lot of deeper Kabbalistic thought in a lot of senses. So the finite intrinsically has no being, but it's rather the movement of the world spirit. It is the tendrils of the world spirit sort of manifesting into this experiential mode, and becoming a phenomenon through relation and through perception. And that is essentially, for him, there's no law of history, there's only law of nature, because there's only this one world spirit. There's only there's one object. That is everything. And it's its own interaction, which is basically pushing things forward. So for Hegel, the capacity, the exercising of freedom and the exercising of reason is the capacity to essentially determine what stage of the world spirit that you're in, and what is the will of the world spirit right now, like what's it doing, what's the law right now, and then to figure out how to do that, right? So it's very interesting sort of thing. It's a lot more adaptive than Kant is in a lot of ways, because Kant legislates from the pulpit, whereas Hegel is like, well, it's there's terms, there's periods to Hegel, which becomes important with Marx, right? So core concept, Hegel has a fundamentally teleological view of history, and if you remember teleology from our Aristotle and Plato, super important when dealing with a lot of philosophical views of history. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, just a refresher, and it's basically studying or describing things based off of their end. So for instance, and also determining the qualities of something based off of its end goal, its primary, its final effect, if we're going to use a causal language to describe it. But for instance, and like something that kind of falls within our scope to an extent, you take the concept of Mashiach and the Zon Mashiach. From a teleological perspective, all of history and all events can be understood by their relationship to bringing about that final end, right? So ex post facto, when you're going towards the specific thing, and let's say when we like in our days speedily, when we're in the age of Mashiach, we're in the times, we'll be able to retroactively understand all events as happening and specifically how they contributed to that end, even though we understand that all acts are contributing towards that end. So that is a fundamental teleology by which that the quality and the substance and the form of objects are defined by their relationship to a final end. So Hegel is also very much into teleology. For Hegel, he's basically taking a Christian eschatology. He really is very much. He's dealing with an end of days situation, an end of history in a lot of ways, which is kind of ironic. I use that phrasing, but he's basically taking Christian mystic eschatology and adapting it into a German rational mode, German rational language. And so his teleology is super important because Marx is really going to use that teleology a ton. And then his concept of dialectical difference between things. So we're familiar with dialectics as such, I would say, probably all of us here, the concept of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We're going to be getting into a bit later. What I really want to focus on is the different forms of difference that Hegel is dealing with. So his dialectical difference as opposed to classical and accidental difference. And then later we're going to deal with Nietzsche's take on that, which is affirmation as opposed to negation. So that's going to be an interesting thing later when we get to like Nietzsche and Deleuze. Right, so going right into those dialectics, you got your thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's a big question as to whether this formulation is attributed to Hegel. There's not really a lot in Hegel, which, contemporarily how the formulation is used, it's not super Hegelian, but at the same time, like people have been using dialectical logic since like Socrates and like a bunch of other places. So Hegel gets a lot of credit for it. I'm fine with that. It's an interesting thing. His main point really was dialectical difference, however, and less about that process orientation to a degree. Well, kind of difference in procedure. So according to Hegel, objects are objects. Like for instance, a cup and another cup are two cups. Let's say I have one cup made out of brass and I have one cup made out of silver. They are both objects, but they are not self-identical, right? So what that means is that it has an extant existence, but it is not defined by the qualities which fundamentally define itself, but rather there are contradictions which are inherent within the object. Like let's forget the two cups. Let's talk about the concept of like freedom, for instance. You have freedom as a historical concept. Also, Hegel would also call it a natural concept. Freedom comes into the world at a certain point, right? And it is a imperfect freedom because the world spirit is moving in a trajectory. And one of its tendrils, the freedom tendril, is there. Now there are contradictions to this raw freedom, or to this imperfect freedom, which is freedom encounters through its exercising, through its adaptation, through its implementation by different societies. These contradictions are fundamentally embedded and mutually interpenetrated within the freedom itself, within the idea itself. And as it resolves through this process, it basically confronts, so you have your thesis, right? That freedom, it confronts the antithesis, which is, let's say, call it slavery, which exists fundamentally actually as a negation of freedom. And according to Hegel, that means that because the object isn't necessarily self-identical, it's not freedom because it's freedom because it is also the capacity to have the negation for freedom and its variance and its variable manifestations within itself, within the object itself. As it resolves that contradiction, it negates slavery, and then it actually just becomes a more perfect freedom, right? That's actually the Hegelian dialectical difference. So the synthesis is actually you have a less perfect freedom, which resolves its imperfections and negates its imperfections, and it becomes more perfect. And then that happens throughout history until eventually you reach an end times in which there is just an apotheosis, like a perfection. Right. So just rephrase, like I said, you begin with a thesis, and the thesis is confronted and augmented by circumstances, and those confrontations and augmentations are the contradictions. However, those contradictions only exist because there's a quality within the thesis itself, which is the capacity for contradiction. There's an imperfection. Those things are negated, and then it becomes a more perfect thesis. So really, it's object-oriented. It's just this one idea that's moving through history, and it's changing. It's becoming more itself. So then your progress, according to Hegel, is measured by the idea that you have at the given time. So for instance, freedom in ancient Greece, according to Hegel, would be less. We have made progress since then because there isn't, like, at least in the West, because there isn't like the same degree of chattel slavery in the world. I mean, or at least in Greek society. You get what I'm saying, right? according to Hegel, if you can see an idea becoming more perfect in the world, then it is progress. So then, like we said before, I'm really into the concept of Hegelian difference, not necessarily the dialectic as a process, but the concept of his difference is different than the classical or accidental differences. For Hegel, like I said, things become more themselves, and differences or contradictions, antitheses, they exist to be negated. So the rule of nature of the world spirit is to have these perfect objects, which are perfect on transcendental or transcendentally perfect, as like a Platonic form almost, which come into this world, and they are awash in mortal sin. And through their process of becoming more themselves, they confront things which come to negate that one thesis and come to say an opposite. Those differences exist to be resolved, and then the thing becomes more itself, right? Versus an accidental difference, which is the difference between a brass cup and a silver cup. Basically, they exist in two different spaces, and one is brass and one is silver, and those things are therefore different. For Hegel's perfect cup, actually the differences of silver and brass would be sublated into each other through this dialectical process, and then it would just become a more ideal perfect cup until the perfect cup exists in the perfect world. And that's the movement of the world spirit. Right. So his teleology, like we said, is that the thesis will become the ultimate form of itself. That is the end goal of history. And everything has a thesis for the most part. Everything is an object for him, and we're all moving towards this ultimate perfection. Idealism's freedom, remember, is unbound reason. So there's a perfect reason that is being moved towards, and there's perfect freedom, which is that reason which is being moved towards. He also holds that you can rationally determine the ultimate end of human history, which is why he is, going out throughout this entire process. Every philosopher who's going to come up with a world philosophy, or like an ultimate philosophy or stuff like that, is going to assume that they're basically at the end of history in a lot of ways. They think they're doing the right thing. And so for Hegel, it's an interesting thing because he kind of uses the concept of the end being embedded in the beginning to kind of like, he has like an inverse teleology. Basically, one of the things that he's saying is that from my perspective, he is totally subsumed in German rationalism and German idealism. And reason and rationality and unabated or unhindered, unadulterated, just capacity for that form of freedom is by and large, just that is king in this tradition. And so he basically says, in that tradition, coming from that tradition, that the ultimate end of human history is for us to become so self-conscious and so using our reason, employing our reason, and perfecting that reason through the synthesization of antitheses, that we will actually achieve an apotheosis, that we will become gods, or become God in a sense. We will return to the world spirit through the use of our reason and through the refinement of our qualities. We will get to that original source. And this is where Hegel does have this concept that consciousness is the world spirit, if you're going to be a more mystical Hegelian, and that we are returning to that form of universal consciousness to a degree. So I would say in a lot of ways, it's a return to Plato through Aristotle. You're using your inductive reasoning, you're using your interactions with the world, the relationships between objects to achieve an ultimate understanding of your own form and of other things' forms until you get to the monad, which is the one form to rule them all. Cool. So his entire thing is just be in touch with the Geist. Know what the world spirit needs of you, know what it's sending you, know what your job is, and do your job. And then through that process, you'll be able to achieve that apotheosis. Yeah, so his politics, really interesting within Hegel himself. I mean, Hegel politically has been used by, especially in the Marxist tradition, and from dialectical materialism, et cetera, in every which way. More or less, like I said, for Hegel, there isn't a lot of history. There's a lot of nature. And that law of nature is the movement of the world spirit. He's all about timeliness in a lot of ways. He's about knowing what you're supposed to do based off of basically your rational prophecy in a lot of senses is really what Hegel is getting at. And yeah, so there you deal with the contradictions and resolutions. So you're not necessarily dealing with something which is fundamentally changing, because for Hegel there is no fundamental change. Things actually just become more themselves. And yeah, so that in and of itself can be problematic in certain aspects. However, his epistemology is where Hegel tends to be used a lot by conservatives, because he has this phrase which basically says that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. Now, the owl of Minerva, or Athena, is basically she's the Greco-Roman, Athena Minerva, Greco-Roman goddess of wisdom or battle strategy, really. The owl is her folkloric animal, even though it's also a demon in ours. So, there's that. But basically what he's saying is that you can only have knowledge in retrospect. After the day has set and it's dusk, then you can have understanding of like what the world spirit's will was, what is actually going on, what is the nature of things. So like a person operating with that epistemology is going to be more like a David Hume type character. Like they're going to look at what's happened and they'll be like, well, it's like kind of working like this thus far. Like we're not doing things like terribly wrong necessarily. I mean, it's easy for them to say. And then, being aristocrats, and then kind of easing into gradual change in a lot of ways. It's not necessarily intrinsically, his epistemology, I wouldn't consider it to be intrinsically revolutionary in a lot of degrees. And it can actually lend to some like Humean or Humean like conservatism in a lot of ways. I forgot about this one. Headline Hegel. So remembering what we're dealing with, that the concept of history is that the concept of historical events is that objects are moving towards their perfection by engaging with circumstances and then sublating them. Remember that the antithesis doesn't exist separately from the thesis, and the thesis doesn't exist separately from the antithesis until the ultimate form, which is the perfect thesis. Should one invest in cryptocurrency? And if so, to what end /why? All right. That is what I got. I will be sending this out and I will be publishing the slides as well. I need to figure out more how to do that, but thank you everybody. And I hope you guys enjoy this one.